Proves once again that this is a bipartisan issue because he was none other than the chairman of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, during the 2000 presidential election. One might suppose he has the best interests of the Democratic Party, even yet, in mind and in heart. So we'll look for some advice for the current administration from their old doyen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. And I want to start out by saying I've come to many of these things. I've come to too many. It's not that I don't like you. You're all wonderful people. As Alan Dershowitz said, this is and has the feel of a civil rights movement. And Madam Rajavi has been very gracious the times that I've been in Paris to tell me how much myself and our other officials have helped this cause. But I look at where we are, and I'm not sure that all of our speaking out, that all of our rallies in front of the White House, in Geneva, in Paris, in Brussels, here in Washington, in the Cannon Building, I'm not sure that we've accomplished much. And it is incredibly frustrating to me. I want to stop coming to these meetings. I want to see you all in Tehran someday. And you know, Director Free and I, and he's been to many, many meetings too, and is devoted to this cause. We talk about how difficult it is to be at the end of the row of speakers, because so much has been said that we wanted to say ourselves. And today it's been said in a resoundingly good fashion. Senator Amato talked about the fact that what our country has done here is a disgrace. And I echo those sentiments. When I first got involved with this issue back in July and started learning about Ashraf and learning about the fact that the United States government, a general of the United States forces, contracted with each and every one of the residents of Ashraf. If they relinquished their weapons, we promised that we would protect them. Have we lived up to our promise? Absolutely not. Maybe until 2009, we did a pretty good job, thanks to General Phillips and Colonel Martin, who's not with us today. We did a fine job protecting them. But all of a sudden in 2009, when we turned it over to the Iraqis, all responsibility for military action and for police action was turned over to the Iraqis, we essentially washed our hands on that promise. And yes, Senator D'Amato is right. In 2009 and in 2011, not only did this attack occur with the use of vehicles and weapons that had been given to the Iraqi police by the United States of America, but United States forces in both instances were withdrawn from the immediate area so they couldn't do anything to stop the carnage. Is that living up to our promise? Of course not. It's diametrically opposed to the promise we made. And that general was speaking for the United States of America and for all 300 million of our citizens. Subsequent to that, have we stood by the residents of Ashraf? Did we take a stand and say, wait, why can't we do this right here in Ashraf? Why does there have to be a closure of the camp? To what purpose? Iraqi government, tell me a purpose, a legitimate purpose to Iraqi security or anything else that's going to be served by closing down Ashraf. Well, the only excuse we ever heard, all of us, was the belief that there's intimidation in Ashraf and the individuals could not be free to speak their will about where they wanted to go if everyone remained in Ashraf. Well, that would have been an easy problem to solve. Just set up, the general could tell me where, set up something outside the gates, bring the individual residents one by one to see the UN people, and they could talk freely right there. There was no need to close Ashraf in the beginning. And the United States government should have stood by the residents and stood by our promise and said no. And then how are we going to ensure protection of the residents? Well, it's my belief that we should have done one of two things. One, we should have left a small number of United States Marines by to protect the residents of Ashraf until they were all out of the country. You know, I hear we were all told, well, we can't do that because we've agreed to leave. Well, we agreed to leave South Korea. And General, am I right? Are there still U.S. military personnel in Korea?
Just a few.
And how many years has that been? About 40?
Longer than I've been around, sir.
That's right. So we could have easily done that and lived up to our responsibilities. One of my proudest moments as a supporter of the president was when the president said, we are not going to let the residents of Benghazi be subject to genocide. And U.S. military power and NATO power is going to stop that from happening. And we did, and we toppled one of the world's worst dictators. Well, we never contracted with the people in Benghazi. We never promised them anything. But we, as America, the defender of democracy and freedom in this planet, we believed it was our right to do so. And we did. Well, we signed a contract with these residents. They're in a much better position to expect our help and our protection than the residents of Benghazi were. And we've turned our back on them. And one of the things, and I'm sure the director will tell you, because we get on almost weekly calls with Ambassador Fried, who is handling this for the State Department, it is stunning to me that the United States government wants to disengage here. They didn't want to be a part of the signing of the MOU. They reluctantly agreed, I think from pressure from us, to send U.S. observers into so-called Camp Liberty, although it's not clear when they're coming. They can never come unannounced. We thought there'd be around-the-clock presence. Now it's not clear that there'll be much of a presence at all. We've disengaged. We wipe our hands of an issue when we gave our word. So yes, as our moderator said, it's time for the U.S. to stand up. It's time for us to fulfill our responsibility. It's time to not only fulfill our obligation to the residents of Ashraf, but many of you who've been coming here have heard me say this before. It's time to fulfill our obligation to the 4,000 plus United States soldiers who died in Iraq. You've heard me say, as governor of Pennsylvania, I was the commander-in-chief of the Pennsylvania National Guard, and no National Guard in the country lost more men and women in Iraq than Pennsylvania did. And I used to comfort the families, or at least try to comfort the families, by telling them that their sons, or in one case their daughter, had died creating democracy and freedom and making Iraq a better place. And I don't know what I would say to them now, knowing what I know about what's happened here. So it's time for us to act. What should that action be? Well, first and foremost, we should not let Camp Liberty be turned into a prison. We should not. That's job one for the United States, job one for the UN. And I was happy to see the UNHCR say that freedom of movement was essential. Because everyone says, well, this is a refugee camp. It's meeting the standards of a refugee camp. But what's the difference between the normal refugee camp and what's proposed at Camp Liberty? The difference is the residents of the normal refugee camp can leave. They can go if they have the ability. If there's a park or a river down the road, they can go to the river and bathe and swim and recreate. They can go to the park. If they have any money at all, they can even go to the local market. They have freedom of movement. That makes a huge difference when you're talking about what goes on in the camp and what level of environment is going to exist in that camp. Here, the Iraqis have made it clear that there will not be, as long as their position holds, freedom of movement, that the people are going to be inside this small area forever. We should insist, as the UNHCR said, the U.S. should insist that there be freedom of movement. We should insist that the MOU be enforced. There's not one resident of Ashraf over there yet, and the MOU is being torn asunder. The MOU clearly says that the residents can take personal property and vehicles. The Iraqis now say that that's not the case. It is time for us, the United States, to join the UN and to be heard loud and clear, whatever the leverage is. And I agree with Ambassador Ginsburg. We've got that leverage, and we should enforce it. It's time to be heard. It's time to say, no one's going. No one's leaving until you live up to the MOU. The Iraqi government, you live up to the MOU and you allow freedom of movement. Next, it is time to delist. If you've been coming to these regularly, you've heard me say in the last 2 months that I think we can put delisting on the back burner. The most important thing is the safety of the residents. But I don't believe that anymore. And let me tell you why. Ali Raza sent me a FARS news agency release, and you all know what the FARS news agency is much better than me, in which it quotes the Iranian ambassador to Iraq, a man, if I'm pronouncing his name right, Danifar. And let me read you just a couple of quotes from this release. The ambassador of the Islamic Republic of Iran in Iraq stressed that the UN and its representatives in Iraq, in meetings they have had, have repeatedly stressed that the UN considers the MEK a terrorist group and will not support it under any circumstances. Then he goes on. It says, Danifar referred to U.S. officials' support for the terrorist group. That's all of us up here. He referred to us and said, the terrorist MEK group in the past few years has been constantly supported by the U.S. and Western elements. But it is interesting now that the U.S. government has announced it is not prepared to accept even one member of this terrorist organization and under no circumstances would allow them onto its soil. It goes further. Acceptance of the members of the terrorist group by the government of Iran will not include leaders, and the amnesty will include individuals whose hands are not tainted in blood, meaning that this idea that we can relocate all the residents of Ashraf to Liberty and there'll be no arrests, he's given fair warning here. Now, what was our response? We brought all of this up with Ambassador Fried. His response was, oh, the Iranians, they exaggerate all the time. They don't really tell the truth. You can't believe anything they say. They just say things for effect. That's not engagement. That's not us living up to our responsibility. It is time to delist just because of these statements. Just because of the statements. So, we have talked and sent a message to Madam Rajavi that we think it is time to act. It is time to stand up. If the State Department won't delist as it should voluntarily, it's time to go back to court. It's time to say to the court, we want you to mandamus. Mandamus is a legal term in which the court requires an agency or an individual to do what they are statutorily required to do. The court gave an order to the State Department to come back and show evidence why the MEK should not be delisted. The court can issue a mandamus to say to them, come in here within 30 days and show us why the MEK should not be delisted. Now, some people say, well, don't issue a mandamus, don't go seeking a mandamus, because all that'll mean is the State Department will say, we're not delisting them. But if they say that, then the court is asked to review the evidence. And when they reviewed the evidence in 2008, when Secretary Rice refused to delist, they found there wasn't any evidence. And if they review the evidence in 2012, guess what they're going to find? That there isn't any evidence. So it is time to stand up and say, this is not a terrorist organization. There's no evidence to the contrary. In the last decade, no open source terrorist database, and they're all over the internet, these terrorist databases, has listed one single act by the MEK or any of its members of terrorism. And the statute says terroristic acts against the United States of America. That hasn't happened, and it's never going to happen. So let's delist, and let's get all of the congressmen who came in here, and they've been good allies, and they've spoken up, and they've passed resolutions. And those are all good things, and those have all increased the pressure. But it is time. I know if Senator Amato was still in the Congress, there would be a bill along the lines of what Ambassador Ginsburg said. The only way to hit them is to hit them where it counts. No military planes